All right, good morning. This is a meeting of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, and we have a quorum and we're ready to begin. I hear that Peter will be joining a little bit late. And does anyone know of other folks who are going to be with us, or do we expect that this is who we're going to have for this meeting?
Rich, I just want to note that Jared noted in the chat, Jared Duval, that he's here. He just has his video off due to connection issues, in case you didn't happen to notice that.
Right, thanks. Yes, I see him. Okay, that's fine.
Yes.
Yeah, Joey?
I understood that Ms. Miller will be late, potentially unable to attend, and Gina will be about 15 minutes late.
Okay, thank you. So I look forward to Gina and Liz joining us when they can. All right, so for this meeting, I think we have some serious conversations to have. Really looking forward to that. And we can begin just by looking at the agenda. Are the minutes from last time? Any comments concerning the minutes? Objections? All right, we're, as usual, without objection, we consider the minutes to be adopted, approved. And for today's agenda, I think it's really important for us to consider how we're going to take on board the comments that we received from the full council a couple of days ago, and what program adjustments we might want to make, what additions or amendments to the recommendations we might want to make, and perhaps even more importantly, what steps we need to take to communicate the content of the task leads and subcommittees' recommendations. How we're going to communicate those and answer questions that counselors have about the policies that we have been advancing. So we might want to make adjustments to the policies, and we might want to figure out good ways to answer the questions of our fellow counselors. Welcome, Liz. And because what I heard, I'll be interested in your reactions to this. I heard kind of three major kinds of concerns addressed at the full council meeting. One was just concern about the overall process and the pace that the legislature has put us on. And the public outreach portion of that is something that needs to be addressed by the full council. And as some people pointed out, that may require, it does require taking actions after December to make sure that we get public engagement as consideration of the plan goes forward in the legislature and elsewhere. So the sort of pace of the overall project was part of what was going on in reaction to concrete proposals. A second level of concern, and totally understandable in my view, was that the counselors who haven't had the opportunity to bear down on these issues the way we have a lot of questions. And even some members of our subcommittee have questions about, how would this work? And tell me more about this. I just need to know more. And that's, I think, perfectly legitimate. And we may be able to help counselors by reaching out to them, or even one-on-one conversations, so that they at least can understand what our proposals entail before they're asked to vote on it. And so that's something we might want to talk about. A third kind of objection would be more substantive objection to the recommendations themselves. That is, counselors might have an objection to a policy that we are proposing, not because they don't fully understand it, but because they just don't like it. So I didn't see a lot of that in the meeting, the full council meeting, frankly. I saw more of the second category of concern. And I'll pause there and suggest that during this meeting today, we address ourselves at least to those three categories of concerns. Each yields a different kind of action step. And now at this point, I'm just asking you, do you see it that way? Or would you say, no, you've got it wrong, Rich? I see the problems somewhat differently. All right, Christine, Jared.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I think that that's a fair characterization and framing. I guess I would just suggest that we spend the bulk of this meeting on the second one, the areas where counselors have questions, because I don't think that there's a lot we can do about the pace right now. It kind of is what it is. We're going to do our best, and we can also identify, areas where we need to continue working post December 1st. And I really do think that there's an important message to keep sharing, which is this initial plan is not a plan that will be set in stone. It is starting, it is our best attempt. My personal view on this is that what this plan will be is our best attempt with the information at hand to put together a plan that meets our legal requirements. It will then necessitate and lead to review and action by the legislature, rulemaking processes from state agencies, and there will need to be further public engagement throughout that process and then into any implementation of any policies or rules. I get the sense that, and maybe this is not a fair characterization, but I get the sense that some folks think that like December 1 is the that's it. And I really think it's just step one. It's not the end of the road. And so, yeah, the pace has been fast. There's been a lot to do in a short amount of time, but at the same time, we've worked on this and done our due diligence for a year. So I think we just have to do the best we can with the timeline as it is. I don't know as there's a lot more to say there. I also didn't hear a lot of substantive objections to the recommendations yet. I felt they were more in the category of clarifying questions. So the extent to which we can figure out how we respond to those, either individually or in writing with like a frequently asked questions or a written response to some of those questions, or in follow-up meetings, I feel like that would probably be the best use of our time today.
Thanks, Jared. Welcome, Peter. So Liz, and then Bram.
Yeah, I agree with Jared. And the only thing I would add, I think that at least when I look at our section, and I think this applies to the other areas as well, one of the best things we could do to help all of us as a council get to December 1st would be to go back through our written product and think about places where in that written product, we can also give essentially the assurance of the additional work. I think we have many counselors who, unless they can see on paper that what they're going to be saying yes to includes the complexity acknowledgement that further policy work or legislative work or research, depending on which bucket it falls in, must be done, it will be hard for them to stand up and get behind it. And so we saw a little version of that, ironically, in a relatively straightforward potential policy on bill financing. And it happened to be one that Christine and I had a little back and forth on. So it was actually kind of like interesting to me that that's where that came up. But I don't know, Christine, I'd be interested in your perspective. I think after that, I bet that your feeling is you go back and you clarify a little and say, pilot, development, best process. So the recommendation is about getting to the best policy rather than thou shalt have an on-bill policy, because I think that was part of the problem. Anyway, so I think we could help this a lot by going through and doing that with all of our policies and thinking about which ones could be modified somewhat.
Thanks, Liz. And what I take from your comment and Jared's together is a general reminder to folks that the plan is a blueprint. It's not detailed engineering drawings, and it's a step in a process that will have to go through legislative action and administrative interpretation. And there's a lot of there'll be a lot of opportunity to work out those details. That's number one. And number two, as you just said, we can clarify in our own writing the answers to some of the questions in people's minds. Bram and then Joey.
So I think two things. One is, I think over the next few weeks, we absolutely need to make sure that there's a way for counselors to have all of their questions answered. And, I've seen a couple suggestions that we, need to sort of trust each other and trust that the other subcommittees have done their work. I'm willing to accept that if it means that when we ask a question, we believe the answer we get. I don't think we should say, well, I don't understand it, but I'm just going to trust them, right? I think every counselor has the right to really understand everything we're proposing. And the second question, which I think, may be an answer to some of these questions about how do we get, what's the right way to address the fact we haven't had as much community input as we'd like, for instance. We've got a December 1st deadline, and then there's a rulemaking process, and then there's an implementation process. And after that, there is the requirement that we hand in a revised plan within 4 years, or anytime up to 4 years. And, one answer to a lot of those questions is that we could say, we're going to do a revised plan in 2 years. We're going to give rulemaking and implementation a year. And once we've seen how that works, we're going to take that out for community input and incorporate the data that we've gotten from that implementation and hand in a revised plan. And I think that, or set the date wherever makes sense. But that would be an answer to a lot of those questions about how are we going to do the things that we have not yet been able to do to our satisfaction.
Thank you. Joey?
No, I think I'm really, I think the comments that people are making and I generally echo and support them. And I think just underscoring that, yes, we should create venues for counselors to get their questions answered, and underscoring that, yes, this will be iterative. I very much wonder about and would be willing to, it seems like, there's a lot to cover in short order. I think we got like quarter to halfway through 1/4 of our consensus recommendations. So, I wonder about a different sort of approach where, as a task group, and we've been meeting regularly, both like sort of set with different partners, and I've been reaching out and have tried to invite folks to ask questions, but I think just that has not been enough. And so what I wonder about is, can we as task groups, I would be willing to, and I know it's a lot to ask potentially, but just create a space, a venue, a Zoom webinar as a task group to invite a public event where we would invite folks to come in and go deeper on our task group recommendations specifically. So it would be sort of, we did the joint stakeholder events with the Public Service Department, but now we have very more specific things on the table. And I would say publicly warned, but a different event where, meeting with the cross-sector task group leads, be able to go much deeper into the recommendations that we have put forward as one way to potentially try to complement the process and get people's questions answered. So That's one specific recommendation I would make. And I don't know, I know people have limited time, but it seems like that might be a constructive way. Just divide it up and create a space and record it. So if people can't attend at that moment, they could watch otherwise. And I'm always certainly happy to follow up with more specific answers via email or, shared resource, et cetera.
Peter and then Christine. You're on mute.
Muted, Peter.
You're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. That didn't actually change anything. I went back to the previous setting. Thank you for the comments that other folks have made. I think there are a few things that we need to consider. There are two audiences at play here. I think that we need to be careful that we're not trying to meet the same ones in the same way. One is there are very specific questions from counselors around the programs. Some of those came out in the surveys beforehand. Some of them came out during the meeting on Tuesday. I think it would be very helpful for us to think about some sort of FAQ kind of document, taking those questions that we've gotten thus far and providing clarity to them. The second, and to Joey's point, I think is more around sort of public engagement around there are these ideas that we presented. What would the public at large like to think about that? I don't think that's necessarily going to be a great way to get that information to the counselors in a timely manner. I do think it's an important step in the process, and we'd be certainly willing to do that for non-energy pieces. But I think we just need to hold those sort of two separate goals in our minds. I think if, to Bram's point, there's deference, and then there's the ability to feel comfortable that you're signing your name something that you can agree to. And so I think it's certainly giving them the education that they need. And we've all reflected on the sort of challenges with the amount of information that we provide, right? Because there's the tension between providing too much so that it's not accessible and providing not enough so that there's not enough detail. And sort of we're trying to find that balance, and we're going to continue to try to find that balance as we go forward. And I think that's one way we could be super responsive. We also, I think it would behoove us to identify, there are a couple of questions from folks that I saw in the response to the survey around the non-energy pieces that I would love to just reach out. I will reach out to those all individually to have the conversations that it helps to, that we started to have individually, but so that they can feel comfortable with the state of the information, whether or not they agree with the proposal or not. They can at least evaluate it more fully. And I would encourage others to do that as well, because those who took the time to do the survey, I'm very appreciative, because it gave me a sense as I was going through the presentation for you all to sort of try to answer some of those as we went, because I knew those questions were out there.
All right, thanks, Peter. And Christine.
I basically was going to say the same thing that Peter said, and he said it much better, so I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, so I do take away from this conversation, at least at a minimum, the notion that we need to do three things. First, just go back through our written materials and make sure that in general, they are responsive to the questions we know typically arise in the reader's mind on these things. We've been very, we have a broad range of topics that we're addressing, and not a lot of, how do you say it, explication in our written materials. And we don't want to answer every question, but we kind of know what people are going to be concerned about. We need to address that. And the second suggestion I've heard is that we create something like an FAQ for each of the subject areas. And the third would be, as Peter just said, reaching out individually to counselors who have asked specific questions. Joey,
I would, can I ask this is a question maybe for Jane, who I'm going to look at across my screen here and I'll relay the answer if you can't hear it, is a question of timing of version control of drafts, I think more than anything else, right? Because I think it'll be important for us to eventually to update our drafts to reflect, to provide that additional explication. At what point should we be doing that is more of the question, because otherwise it might just get confusing.
Yeah, good point. Jane?
Heard some of that. It was like the key moment of signing on when it happened. So I think we're talking about timeline around drafting and revisions. Okay. When we had some conversation yesterday about this and started to think about the recognition and appreciation that the number of comments and considerations from the council were really, we only started to scratch the surface in the conversation the other day. And so it felt the way that we had set up expectations and timelines around drafts is that they would go to the council the week before a meeting, the council would have a chance to discuss them, and revisions would then be posted within 1 week. We're sort of revisiting that conclusion right now and recognizing and appreciating that there's a lot of work to be done through all the avenues that you're discussing, whether it be one-on-one conversations, further conversation with the full council, public meetings, however you decide to proceed, that make it somewhat futile to feel like you could be expected to revise and update drafts by Tuesday and have them in somewhat of a static fashion for the final draft. So I know that we haven't said that explicitly to Ag and Eco and Rural Resilience. We're going to see how their meeting goes on Tuesday, hope that they're able to not have to lift up so many issues and then have them proceed with final drafts for the following week. But my feeling at this point for cross sector is that we should hold on revisions and they should be works in progress. And that our hope would be that the next meetings on the 16th and likely the 17th for the council as well will be the place where the final decisions and clarity are brought to bear about how the work is communicated and then put forward on the 23rd in a final comprehensive draft. That's not a lot of clarity. I suspect there's going to be a special meeting of the steering committee tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. That's where it seems to be headed based on a number of emails and things. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but one of those meeting's particular focus is going to be on process over the next 2 weeks and timeline. So hopefully there'll be more clarity after that.
Thanks, Jane. One point to note is that there could be a difference between, on the one hand, the text of the cap, which, just for production reasons, we have deadlines that we have to meet and it has to move along. On the one hand, and the text of a FAQ kind of document that could be, proceeding in parallel, but could be updated as necessary and added to as questions arise. And so it might be useful for us to just not to, restrict too much what we communicate through an FAQ kind of document, just because we have a production deadline on the plan itself. Joey?
Well, I'm certainly open to all kinds of different strategies to have the conversation and get people's questions answered. We should definitely review the written materials and clarify based on the questions that have been asked and our ability to answer them in this moment. Reach out one-on-one, FAQ, sure. But I also think that the conversation that we had on Tuesday demonstrates that there's just value in a group conversation. So that's why I was just sort of recommending and willing as a task lead to just say, if people have questions about the package of the transportation strategies that we have put forward, I would happily put together a conversation, a Zoom webinar to have that in a conversational format. Then that might also inform what's in an FAQ for people who could not make that meeting. So that's just one other component that it seemed like it may be valuable, and I just wanted to put it on the table. Like, I think I would, I've had many conversation, but I also think it would be with counselors, I think it would be potentially helpful in one more piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. I agree with you that based on the way the conversation went, when we started actually talking, it in a live format with folks, then we were able to ask and answer questions. So it's terrific. What I'm concerned about is the ability of counselors to, log into at 4 or more, and it may end up, if other committees were to do it, 8 or more separate webinar type sessions. It's just, it's really daunting for folks to participate in those things. Now, making ourselves available in a session like that for whoever wants to show up, may be a really good thing. But I think we have to find other ways to help people understand the proposals as well. I'm kind of scratching my head about it, frankly, Joey, because I know it's a good idea. But do people have time to do it? To show up? I don't think they do. Christine?
Yeah, this is a super helpful conversation. And since building/thermal happened to enjoy a fair amount of attention at the most recent council meeting, I wanted to share a couple of observations based on that in the conversation today. I would encourage us to really focus on helping the counselors be in a position to understand what's being proposed with the limited time we have available between now and December 1st, rather than the public outreach, only because time is of the essence. And I think choices need to be made on priority. I can report that Dave Farnsworth, Brian Woods, who's been providing super support, and I met at 9 o'clock yesterday morning, went over what we heard in the VCC meeting for the buildings thermal. And we have already incorporated, through Brian's good work and some writing that Dave did and some stuff I did, the written line-by-line edits that we got from the collection of counselors and one subcommittee member who provided line-by-line edits. And fortunately, we have not found any major mutually exclusive requests for changes, other than the 120K homes weatherized by 2030, which admittedly is a big headline and a big number. And the modeling we've already determined, we've revisited the modeling that EFG and Cadmus has done, and they can get to 70K and meet the building thermal sector target. So I know we're not trying to reach the solutions right now, but I just wanted to provide an example of that we were able to pretty quickly and I think effectively address what we heard in the meeting and what we've seen in writing, and the permission, if we're being given it as CSMS non-council members, to get on the phone and talk to council members who we heard have questions. If that permission is being given to us today, that would be great. And I will offer to execute that. I wouldn't have thought that it was okay to do that on my own without explicitly being given that permission through this process. And I would have been happy to have been doing that all along, but I didn't interpret it to be an appropriate role as a non-council member supporting this process.
Yeah, I mean, can you all hear me? Just so
Yeah, Peter.
Okay. I think that there's certainly no restriction on you reaching out in response to a question. We are working to support the work of the council, and where we see an opportunity to help support that work, then I think we should take it. We have largely put it on council members to reach out to us, reflecting on the fact that they're all super busy and trying to understand all of this material. I think it's fair for us to think about what that how we do that and whether we're doing proactive outreach. I think that's fair. I think it's fair to do that. And I would hope that folks would consider it. The challenge that I see, I think, Joey, with your proposal on the sort of availability sessions is kind of how I would think about it, is that depending on the number of council members that show up, it starts to get into sort of quasi-deliberative council business. And I do think that those conversations should happen at the council, where what I would hope to accomplish with some of the FAQs is to answer the low-hanging fruit kind of questions so that those don't need to be talked about in council deliberations, or the merits of the information, merits of the policy rather than the sort of details of the implementation, or whatever the details aren't the things that are being discussed. Because I think there was just there was some lack of understanding of the overall policies at play rather than the merits of them, if that makes sense, on Tuesday.
Thanks, Peter. This is reminding me, I have a background in planning, and we frequently in the planning world need to discuss the difference between, let's say in land use, the difference between the plan and the zoning ordinance. And the same is true, I think, in what we're doing here. We're creating the plan, we're not writing the regulations. And people need to ask a lot of questions about how it might be implemented, but we can, I think, provide some comfort to folks that they don't need to know all those details right now in order to embrace a general policy thrust. Jared.
Thanks, Rich. One of the things I'm wondering about to aid in this process, and I think that the recommendations of next steps and where to focus are all right, is, as I looked through that list of questions that came from the survey, I thought it was really notable that there was only one issue that had multiple people raising substantive concerns. And that was with regard to the global foundries question. But everything else, those questions, if I understand this correctly from what Jane shared, were counselor, a lot of them were clarifying questions, and I do think there should be a written response to those in the form of an FAQ. But I also think it would be helpful probably for the task leads who are responsible for those recommendations coming forward to, if they haven't already, see that the counselor names attached to those questions to aid in that individual outreach. Because some of them were just clarifying issues, like the question on to the meter on bill financing from, and I think that could aid in just in terms of the efficiency of it. It's not to say that we shouldn't respond to it in writing or have it in an FAQ, but I think the degree to which task leads or subcommittee members know the name attached to that question, the easier it will be to do that outreach, because I think what each of those questions are, they represent the question of one person. It's not the distilled questions and concerns of maybe they represent, the questions of others, but we don't know that at this point.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, I sense that we have a coherent conversation here, and accept, we have general agreement on some of our steps, and we can return to the, how do you say it, how are we going to proceed question, I think, at the end of this meeting, after we go through the substantive comments or discussion of each of the 4 issue areas. But Christine, to answer your direct question, I think you have a go-ahead. You got a green light to talk to counselors who have asked questions. And I certainly feel that I could do the same thing. So I'm happy to talk to individual counselors to answer their specific questions. And I would encourage others who see the need to do that or see an opportunity to answer a particular question, go ahead and do it. Okay, Jane, Jared, is your hand still up?
Yes,
Okay,
different topic.
okay, different topic. I think we need to, if we look at the agenda, our intention is to then have a conversation about feedback we're getting on the subject matter areas. And we should reserve time for, make sure we get a chance to go through those. Jane?
I just want to remind folks, as you're thinking about a frequently answered questions doc, that in the CAP drafting process that Marion is putting in the chat, that Marion anticipated and helped discuss with me how we would respond to comments that are coming in on drafts and actions, and that there is an example at the end of the CAP drafting guidance that provides a suggested format in the table that actually is a template for how to respond to comments and questions and issues that are elevated by council members. So I encourage the subcommittee, as we're thinking through a frequently answered questions doc or response to specific issues elevated through the survey, that we consider using the CAP drafting guidance as a model to do so.
All right, thank you. All right. Jared, your separate point.
Just quickly following up on Christine's point, I wanted to offer members of this subcommittee a quick update from a conversation that happened yesterday at the Science and Data Subcommittee, where we spent a little over a half hour discussing the question of the modeling and the targets regarding home weatherization. It was a very good discussion. I think where folks landed was clarity that the 120,000 number was a total number by the end of 2030, in addition to the 30,000 that have already been done. So that the new would be 90,000 homes. But I think there still are questions that people want to raise around the ramp rate and kind of what is technically feasible in each year as we would do that. And the next step takeaway was that Richard Fazy from the Energy Futures Group has been involved in that modeling, along with Jeff Wilcox from the Office of Economic Opportunity, which manages the low-income weatherization program. They were going to get together and kind of just make sure that the kind of assumptions and projections are being kind of in the final model and plan with more clarity on those numbers.
Okay, I'm just pausing a bit. Well, when we discuss it, Jared, maybe you can help us understand those details.
Sure.
Because it's such a specific number that it does cause people's eyebrows to jump up and
Yeah.
so we do need to help people. If we're going to have a specific number, then we need to help people understand how it could be achievable.
Yes.
David Hill, you want to?
Yeah, thanks. Richard and I had a very good conversation about this early this morning, and he is following up with Jeff, and there will be the one way I've thought about some of this that I shared with colleagues this morning is there's an element to which the plan is somewhat akin to broader 1.5 degree or 2 degree C targets, and the plan and reaching that. And then there are nationally determined commitments, that are helping to then make progress towards those larger goals. So Richard and Jeff, they'll provide a revised profile that could be adopted for the weatherization at scale. And, we'll include that in the narrative, along with a discussion of how the modeling itself, as has been mentioned earlier today, doesn't set the targets for any one individual organization or isn't doing the rulemaking for what then subsequently happens. Those will all be informed by the modeling and the cap, the modeling that supports the cap, but it by itself is not setting an individual agency target or performance metric or those types of things. So hopefully that's helpful.
All right. Well, some of those data could end up in or an explanation could end up in an FAQ kind of document.
Yeah, the way I suggested for our team to address these is to have things that could be, to try to address the comments and the concerns, is to have kind of narrative enhancements that are kind of text call outs that address, say, this is what the customer perspective for a propane heating customer could look like. This is a discussion why the CHS is not prescriptive and how it does apply to commercial and industrial. This is what the economics for transportation customers could look like and those types of things. So we're going to try to do those as specific call out boxes and individual sections of text in our document.
All right, thanks. Any more on this general topic? Or do we want to turn our attention to individual subject areas?
So one thing that Jane and I were just discussing was, I think it makes sense. The table that that Jane and Marion just shared is really simple. It's basically like, what's the comment? Where did it come from? What's the response? To make that easy to collate some of those survey results and other things, I would propose that the staff that are supporting you in this work put those into the tables and then give you a chance to respond in the response to that comment piece. And that might make things move a little faster, if that would work for folks. Just essentially pre-programming the questions you have to answer.
Yeah. So wait, I just not sure that I got that completely, Peter. And who would be pre-programmed? Who would be?
So example for the buildings group, Brian Woods would be responsible for filling in the comments that we've gotten.
Oh, okay.
From the survey into the things that can be used. Then you can the subcommittee members can work on responses to those comments.
Got it, Peter. I would encourage Brian in that case to also, take a look at what comments were raised orally, and
yeah, I mean, I think that's only really going to be relevant for the buildings crew for the most part.
Good point.
But I'm offering our staff to support that because I know it's just the pulling together of the formatting piece can be a challenge, and we could probably do it quicker and more systematically.
Okay, thanks. Christine?
Just to be clear about buildings and thermal, we have already revised the buildings thermal section with line-by-line responses to the line-by-line comments we've received from the counselors and one subcommittee member who already provided their comments. And we're well along in addressing what we heard in the VCC meeting on Tuesday. So I don't know who made which comments in the survey, but we have addressed what we heard in the survey already in the document. So we don't need this table to do what we have so far, just to be clear. And I'd prefer not to do that work unless it's necessary for us to do it. We focused on the fact that we believe you need from us a section that we think is close to what the council will approve, and that's ultimately the deliverable. So we went straight to that work rather than side work. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
Christine.
do understand that, but based on the comments that Jane made in terms of when the next version of the plan will come out for review, it would benefit council members to see the answers to some of those questions in advance of it. And that would be the purpose of the table, to provide that sort of responsiveness immediately. I think you could copy and paste essentially the work that you've done, or could, add that in. For the rest of us who have yet to do that work, obviously we're starting from scratch, so it's easier. And I'm sorry that you've gone down the path of ultimately getting to the point where we need to be, but I think we do owe some council members some summary of those responses in advance of before the next draft comes out. At least that's my interpretation from what Jane said.
Okay.
Well, it should be possible for Brian actually to look at your revised text, Christine, and post both the question and the answer already that you've already written. So I hope that's not additional unnecessary work for you. And thanks. And by the way, and thanks for just going ahead to do that. I appreciate that you and Dave and Brian already did it. Seems to me we should move on to talk through content. I don't have the agenda on my screen right now, but I seem to recall that buildings was first on our list of topics to address. Is there anything more, Jane and Peter, along these procedural lines that you'd like that I've overlooked? Okay. So we have time on the agenda to, relatively quickly go through all 4 issue areas and discuss feedback we've been getting, additional work that needs to be done, and starting with buildings. So, Christine, is it possible for you to summarize the steps that you've already taken?
Yes. I wasn't sure how you wanted to do this conversation today. We have made enhancements in how we're communicating the core recommendations that pathway strategies and actions we've been talking with you all about since June and with the council since June. The only one that I would say is largely substantive and directional and is not yet resolved yet is the weatherization goal by 2030, and whether that should be framed as a specific number of buildings the way it has been framed up until now or not. And then if it is framed as a specific number of buildings, what should that number be? That was, I think, the most significant area of uncertainty that we heard and or was inferred in the comments that we got in line by line edits from the 4 people that submitted them. Our inclination, just since Tuesday, but we are ready to accept different direction from this group. Our inclination thus far was to stay with a target, a specific number of buildings targeted by 2030. And we had been working from information that I guess is out of date, that it would be that EFG Cadmus had modeled previously, that we could reach the building sector target requirements for GWSA with 70,000 new retrofits. I'm hearing that's been adjusted to 90,000 today. So we certainly have moved away from the 120K by 2030. That was in the most recent version that went to the council. We have blended, we had 2 separate weatherization actions recommended under our first pathway. and we've blended them into one. So I think that's the most outstanding area where we could use further direction or input from CSMS if you wish to weigh in on that. Otherwise, I would characterize most of the other edits and changes that we've made as more just better wording and much more reflective of the approach that Liz Miller articulated early in this call today, of being careful that we frame our recommendation so it's clear that, you know, there's further regulation and or administrative and or rulemaking work that will need to happen and continue to happen in the future. I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for right now, Rich. I really wasn't clear how you all wanted to step through this process.
Well, I'm open here in, you know, to a general discussion. One of the points that I think was probably lurking in the buildings conversation is the difference between and the interplay between building shell renovations, refurbishments on the one hand, and heating sources on the other hand. And you know, I think it's easy for folks to get wrapped up in the difficulty of weatherizing X thousand buildings and overlook the fact that that's only 25% of the answer anyway, and that we definitely need to place a high priority on heat switching. Along with that, it's just a topic that people are less familiar with, and so the focus can easily go to you know, the weatherization finance and what have you challenges without folks understanding the interplay between weatherization and heating sources and types. So it seemed to me that that a general point needs to be made in the thermal section, that these two policies need to go hand in hand, and we need to do both. I'm not sure that I'd have to look at your revised text, but I'm not sure that we articulate that particularly well. Just by listing them as in kind of as separate buckets.
Duly noted. Consider it done.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. So Jared and then Peter.
Thanks, Rich and Christine. I think what you laid out, Christine, makes a lot of sense. I just want to offer a clarification that, and David, please jump in here if you have anything to add, or if your understanding is different than mine. But my sense is that what happened when we had the conversation with EFG and Cadmus yesterday during the Science and Data Subcommittee meeting wasn't that the number was changed. It was that it was clarified that the 120,000 number was a total number of homes and buildings weatherized by 2030, but that means that it's building on top of the 30,000 approximately that have already been weatherized, so that the net addition over the decade would be 90,000. So it was just a clarification of what that 120,000 was. Was it total or net? And I think it was clear that it was net. I'll just say though, that I think it's important to consider, you know, like in the EAN modeling, we do show, and I think this aligns with the EFG Cadmus modeling, that it would be possible to meet the emissions reduction requirements going down to something like 90,000 or maybe even 80,000 new weatherizations by 2030 on top of what has already been done. However, the key consideration there isn't just about the direct emissions reduction that we get from weatherization. It is related to what Rich was saying, the importance of weatherization in terms of a number of the other clean heating strategies. So both in the EFG Cadmus pathways and in the EAN pathways, we're both looking in the range of 200,000 heat pump installations by 2030. And we need to make sure that most of heat pumps work most efficiently and most cost effectively when they are in efficient buildings, weatherized buildings. So, you know, and those I think are single head numbers. Some homes and buildings will have multiple heads. We just want to make sure that there's not too much of a gap between, you know, a modeling or a target for heat pump adoption and homes weatherized, because we want to make sure that people have a good experience, that they're actually comfortable, the units are working well, and that people are saving money. So that's why I just want to say I would be very hesitant to move that number too much lower. But I think if we end up somewhere in the range of 80 to 90,000 new as a target, I hope that that squares the circle in terms of being both feasible while being ambitious and part of a larger package that's necessary.
I just feel the need to say that that's all good and that's very helpful. And I am concerned that any number that's in the scale that we've been discussing today or previously is going to continue to be of grave concern for people who right now are directly involved with the delivery weatherization work and are challenged to see a pathway where we could actually deliver this scale of weatherization and have a prepared workforce capable of delivering that. And I don't know that I can solve that problem or alleviate people's concerns about that myself on the phone between now and December 1st. And because I don't think any of us probably know how we'll solve for that problem yet. And that's work that will involve a lot of people working very hard on before and after December 1st. So
Yeah.
I'm challenged by that and would welcome any guidance from this group on whether you really think we should be specifying a number of that scale in the recommendations that goes back to the council. And if you do, what guidance you can give to me to pass along to Dave Farnsworth as well, who wasn't able to join us today, on how we respond head on to the questions that some pretty influential counselors and people attached to this process have stated very clearly on Tuesday. How will we get the workforce and how will we get this work done?
So I'm not the only one who should respond to this, but Christine, from my perspective, this is one where we have a modeled pathway to achieve the results. We have knowledge of various shortcomings in scaling up to that level at this point. It is not going to be solvable by this group to get there. And that our recommendation is really about mobilizing the people necessary to do the work, to do the work to evaluate how we get there, right? And if the answer is they come back and they say it's not possible, but here's the scale we can get to, then we can reevaluate that in previous next iterations of the plan. But I have a challenge taking a different number or a different approach if our modeled result suggests that that's what it takes. And so I know it's continues to be a hard, but this is this scale of action that it is necessary to meet the emissions reductions. And I don't think we can shy away from that basic math.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I agree with you.
And then the other. So I have a question for you, Christine. When you mentioned you took two recommendations and turned it into one, can you just clarify what you mean there?
Yeah, we had, hold on just a sec. Let me get it right in front of me. We had two actions, Action 1 and Action 2 previously, develop and implement a multi-year statewide weatherization at scale initiative. And under that, we had Action 1, that was the strategy. Action 1 was adopt legislative or administrative recommendations to weatherize 120K homes by 2030. And then we had Action 2, through legislation, require the administration to incorporate implementation of the weatherization at scale working group recommendations into implementation of the Vermont Climate Action Plan. That language has been with us, or that facsimiles of that language have been with us in our presentations before you since June. But in fact, there isn't a real report out from the weatherization at scale working group yet. And we were hoping that it would be out by now, but it's not. And so a couple of counselors in their review comments said, how can we approve Action 2, basically, if there is no report out yet? And that's fair and it's justified. So what we've done is combined those actions into one. We've maintained a commitment to a specific number of homes. We thought it was 70K. We must have interpreted that. We'll change it to 90K. And have not put the council in a position of agreeing to recommendations made in a report that doesn't exist yet, which we thought at the time would.
Great.
Does that
Thanks
answer your question?
That perfect. I'm sure others were
Yeah.
wondering what those come, not
Yeah.
having them immediately in front of me. I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
I guess the other piece you made mention of sort of the resources and workforce development and other things that will be necessary as we go forward. And sort of one thing that we haven't, that kind of hovers in the background of our conversations, but we never really sort of explicitly state, is that to run all of these programs requires people. And as we think about that within the context of some of the recommendations around sort of overall statewide coordination, there's sort of coordination resources that are needed, but there's also actual implementation resources that will be needed. And I think we need to make clear, the legislature likes to create programs without providing the resources to do them. And that's where we fall flat. And so I think we as subcommittee members just need to kind of bear those things in mind as we're thinking those things through. And I'll get off my soapbox.
Peter, thanks. So Jared and then David.
So quickly, I want to agree with what Peter said on the importance of weatherization targets, and I just want to add to that a couple of things. One is, and I don't want to speak for her, but what I heard from Sarah Phillips from OEO yesterday was some level of relief upon hearing that we're talking 90,000 new, not 120,000 new. I do think there's still a question about how feasible is that number, and should it be more in the range of 80 or 70? And I think it's even more important to them and other weatherization providers what the ramp rate is year by year. But I agree with Peter that it is important to have a target in there. And also, just to reiterate for context, every time we have the ability, whether in text or in conversation, that this initial plan is just that, and it is not set in stone. The other big update that I think is really important for this committee to hear that happened yesterday during the Science and Data Subcommittee meeting is we had a report out on the monitoring and assessment task group and work that Cadmus and EFG are leading, and that we've had a task group from Science and Data advising on. And one of the key things that we're looking at is making sure that we are monitoring in real time a number of the key kind of measures, especially related to work being done and kind of things being adopted that we can track in more real time than the kind of often 2 or 3 year time delay we have in the emissions inventory. So for instance, what are the real adoption rates for number of homes comprehensively weatherized? What are we seeing in terms of EV registrations, in terms of heat pump sales and rebates, and on and on and on? And as we track that year by year, exactly as Peter said, we're going to have the opportunity and the responsibility to revise the plan and to issue new plans that may adjust some numbers up, some numbers down based on what we're seeing as we get the data in. But I think in the meantime, it is important that we have a target to shoot for, even if it doesn't lock us in perpetuity.
This is David. I agree, and I think that these are helpful comments. I apologize for any levels of confusion on the existing new incremental number of weatherizations that have arisen. And, you know, again, I think had a very good conversation with Richard Fazy this morning. He's also following up with Jeff Wilcox. And, you know, we discussed the issues of the ramp and being clear that the plan itself doesn't establish operational targets, but that those and any rulemaking and budgets, et cetera, and the recommendations of the weatherization at scale working group all are informed by the modeling, and the numbers that the modeling suggests are necessary to meet the CAP goals. As Jared said, the tracking and monitoring will be very important. And there are also kind of qualitative elements too that, you know, you're likely to attract, if there is a clear target, you can attract more private capital from the construction, you know, and renovation segment that doesn't really address weatherization type opportunities at the level that they could right now. There's also on workforce development, you know, we could make weatherization more. I like Dave Farnsworth's discussion of the modernization of the building sector and, you know, the modernization of weatherization services. Let's make it more hip and, you know, more technically oriented, and perhaps there's still, you know, there's still work that's grunt work, but, you know, if bots and drones are being used to crawl around in attics as opposed to people, you know, that's possible these days. We can kind of modernize the delivery of these services and how they're done as well. And you know, those are qualitative, but I think some messaging around that. Richard's going to be drafting some of this material, and I think that can also be helpful to help put it in the context of transformational development, evolution of the sector and the services that it's providing.
For some reason, I can't hear Rich. Can you hear me? Interesting. I'm not sure what's...
I think Rich is just on mute.
Okay, I'm sorry. If I can just, this has been super helpful. Thank you very much. I needed that little pep talk to stand behind the 90K because it was a little sobering listening to the conversation on Tuesday. And the suggestion of adding, I've taken away from this conversation, adding some language that we don't have at all yet about, you know, keeping track of how progress is being made and adjusting and pivoting based on the actual market activity over time. So that, you know, keeping track of what's happening, and we don't have any language around that. Also beefing up language about how we need both weatherization and fuel switching, and we need them together. And this idea of, I'll have to find my voice about the languaging, but this idea of bots and drones is a new one. And so the concept of continuing to modernize the ways in which we do weatherization as part of scaling up is something we haven't touched on at all in the text so far. And I think there's some opportunity there. So thank you very much. This has been very helpful.
Okay, one thing that I would add to this conversation in terms of pace is the realization that with the clean heat standard, particularly in the early years, significant emission reductions can occur independent of weatherization to a degree. You know, we are succeeding today in putting pellet stoves in people's homes. We're succeeding or can succeed in the early years in substituting biofuels for heating oil. So it's important to point out to people that not every action that we're recommending here, particularly in the early going, requires weatherization to precede heat switching.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important practical kind of common sense Vermont observation to make, that I suspect, Matt Cota has been listening to this conversation, wanting to make that point, but also, we have programs in place to, Matt's nodding. It's just important to point out to people that we're not necessarily climbing Mount Everest, starting tomorrow here, we have programs in place already. We know a lot about some of these solutions, and they don't all require weatherization before we can start saving, reducing emissions. And I think the text, you're nodding, Christine, I think the text needs to point that out. That's one of the advantages of the clean heat standard as a complement to the weatherization policy.
Mhm. I have one question of clarification, Rich. Will weatherization improvements be eligible for clean heat standard
Yes.
credits or? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. I'm not sure that really comes across really clearly in the materials I've seen about that. I often see the list of biofuels and solar thermal and all that, so that I'm going to make that more clear in our work.
Yeah, please do. Please
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, thank you. That's important.
Jane, and then I'm thinking we should turn to our next subject matter.
Yeah, I just after the conversation at Science and Data yesterday, TJ Poor did a little bit of digging, and since we're talking about weatherization deeply again today, I thought maybe David Hill, since you're here and responding, could answer questions regarding that increase, because in the CEP, they had 70,000 additional weatherization as the number, and then it did shift to 90,000. And what we could find based on the understanding of where this came from is an appreciation that the ag sector wasn't going to be able to meet the emissions reductions based on the scale up. And so we were shifting those emissions reductions elsewhere and adding it into weatherization. And so just sort of checking in on our understanding of that it has changed from 70,000 to 90 through the modeling changes and necessary targets in order to meet the emissions reductions, and appreciation and understanding of how the different sectors are going to scale up over time. Is that David went offline, so he might not be able to be with us. There he is.
Oh, I'm still here listening. It's interesting. I don't recall specific modifications that we made in the modeling on the weatherization element related to that kind of decision tree that you just laid out. I think that there are, we have older versions that have lower levels of weatherization, and we have updated versions that have higher levels. But it wasn't specifically that I recall in like, okay, well, the ag sector, it wasn't specific response or decision point related to that. There are, as I said, Jane, yesterday, and then I think you helped to correct me, it's like we can still turn different dials up and down, if you would, but it's a diversified portfolio. I think some of where our thinking came on the weatherization, I would say more so than from an adjustment to the agricultural sector's progress or opportunities, was related to and kind of grew out of the weatherization at scale working group and the discussions that had been around the 120,000, which is, includes the 30,000 existing, so 90,000 more based on that. And so thinking that there is a group that's been really digging into this and examining what it would take in terms of funding and resources to be able to reach that level. My sense is, to the degree that there was a driver for that to be number that's showing up in the modeling, it was more around that than it was as an adjustment to the ag sector reductions.
So I'm going to jump in just from a timing perspective. We're running a little bit late. I think it's probably worth maybe taking this conversation offline to buildings group and conversation with David. And if we have to express it as a range, then we can express it as a range to be further refined going forward. I think the number is going to be large, whether it's expressed as a range or a single figure. So I think there's some opportunity there. Richard, if without further ado, I'd jump into the non-energy piece if you're ready for me.
Thank you.
Okay. The non-energy feedback we got through the survey and comments are almost exclusively related to the Global Foundries proposal, and it is a complicated one, and I'm appreciative of the concern that's out there. I want to clarify a few points that sort of within the recommendation. It's a bit of an odd moment, kind of similar to the conversation about where the weatherization at scale report is. There is an ongoing PUC proceeding that's considering this related matter right now. And so we don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. The state, in the form of the Public Service Department and the Agency of Natural Resources, signed a letter of intent with Global Foundries to explore the opportunities for committing to emissions reductions through that process. From my perspective, the Global Warming Solutions Act requires us to create a plan that creates emissions reductions with sectoral proportionality using whatever tools we have available to us, right? We're going to, create the clean heat standard. It might be electric vehicles incentive, all things that sort of fall over in the sort of overall tool set that the state might have available to us. So the PUC proceeding was just an opportunity to pursue those emissions reductions in a holistic way with what was going on. If that proves to be insufficient in terms of commitment or insufficient in terms of reductions overall, the authority for the Agency of Natural Resources to pursue binding emissions reductions through its own separate rulemaking exists. And we made note of that in the letter of intent. Unfortunately, it sort of got lost in the final wording of a final sentence, but we always reserve our rights in those instances to pursue things if those commitments don't lead to the outcomes we pursue or we try to. And in this case, it's very true. And so for my mind, it's a pathway to emissions reductions that are consistent with the Global Warming Solutions Act. There was some question about whether this exempted Global Foundries from that process. That couldn't be further from the truth. It's just a pathway to get to those emissions reductions. There are a couple of points that have come up in the overall process around that, is sort of what and this relates to our sectoral proportionality discussion that the council approved last week. I can't remember precisely when. The sort of what happens for 2030 numbers. The focus of the LOI was on 2025 with a planning consideration to 2030. That could, with the sectoral proportionality discussion, that provides more clarity around what 2030 numbers might look like. And then there's also the question of what's included within those commitments. And I think this is the sort of the nature of the discussion, is that it sprang from a discussion around, would the renewable energy standard apply to Global Foundries under this new self-managed utility arrangement? And from the perspective that I brought to the table, I said there's an opportunity to get emissions reductions from their facility as a whole. So their electrical sector is about 10%, or electrical emissions are about 10% of their emissions. Their thermal energy use is about 20%, and their process emissions are 70. If we think of those emissions holistically, if they achieve the reductions across the board from that whole pot down to the levels that we would need through Global Warming Solutions Act, that would be acceptable to me from my perspective. And that's why I signed the letter of intent. It was all in this, to my mind, in the service of the reduction requirements associated with the act. And so I think there's some clarity there. And I was looking forward to having that conversation with the council, and we'll look forward to it next week, or whenever we have it, because it's important and it's a critical one. But I think you all we've had more conversation about it, but I think we can provide much more clarity in our write-up as to sort of saying the expectation is that the emission reductions will be achieved just as they are in other sectors. There are different pathways that we could pursue those emissions reductions through to get them to happen. So I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have, and then look forward to writing that up and explaining it to the council as a whole.
Thanks, Peter. Any questions for Peter or follow-up? I'm not seeing any, so I'll ask my question. Peter, it did seem like there's a potential conflict that you're addressing, and the conflict would be between 100% clean energy electricity requirement for the state as a whole, and a major entity that's achieving significant emission reductions, but not necessarily through 100% clean electricity, instead kind of offsetting that, or whatever the right word is here, not doing that, and instead making reductions on the process side, and which would necessarily be an exemption from the 100% renewable electricity requirement. And I'm not asking this question because I think that's inherently a bad thing. It's just that our committee could be in the position of recommending 100% clean electricity, and then also saying, well, except for self-directed utilities that are meeting their emission reductions some other way. And I would think that if that's what we're doing, we should be clear about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really good question. I think if you were to take today's, sort of the way our current recommendation around the renewable energy standard looks, right, it leaves a lot of those sort of specifics fairly vague. But if you were to, not vague, but unanswered, right, there are lots of specifics, and Liz and Ed have done a really good job of framing to say this is a much bigger conversation than this council can and should take on. If you were to take today's renewable energy standard and just extend the timeline and extend the number to 100, there would be an open question as to whether it would apply in this instance. And so that's really the origin of the discussion, was to say, if the goal of the renewable energy standard is to drive emissions reductions, is there an opportunity to think about emissions reductions beyond the electricity sector, given the bulk of their emissions are from process emissions? And so I reflect that there is possibility of conflict within that going forward as the details of the renewable energy standard are developed, of the 100% renewable energy standard. But as of right now, there is this gray area, which is at the heart of the discussion in front of the PUC. So it's difficult. I think we more name it at this point than necessarily reflect that there is a guaranteed conflict, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not a guaranteed conflict. It's
Yep.
a possibility. And if it does make sense to name it. Well, there's another. I'm hearing an echo there. There's another issue, embedded in the clean electricity standard discussion anyway, because at this point, as I understand it,
Richard, you muted yourself.
there we go again. We are not specifying in our recommendation whether nuclear power, for example, would qualify as a clean electricity resource under the 100% target. And personally, I think that's fine. But I don't know I don't know whether the text is sufficiently explicit about that. I don't know, Liz may want to comment on both of these points about global foundries and also about the possibility of clean resources that are not presently deemed as renewable.
I can comment on the second one. The first one, I was having to do the PUC multitask, which is why I just came back on camera. But the current draft that Ed and I have that you all have seen does indicate clean or renewable, carbon-free or renewable. I believe it's among the questions in terms of design. And there's time to do it because the current standard, gets us to the results that we need in the years ahead, one way or the other. So that could be clarified further. I know for at least GMP, we have goals that we're shooting for ourselves with regard to renewable, not just carbon-free. We plan to maintain carbon-free from here on out, but want to find ways to become fully renewable on an annual basis as well. And obviously that's an evolution given both the regional mix and technology over time. So we could certainly clarify that further. It feels like one of the perfect places where pointing out, as we talked about much earlier in my earlier comments, just making the council understand what we're recommending now versus recommending be a discussion going forward. That feels like one of them.
All right, thanks, Liz. Are there other comments on non-energy?
I just
Sorry.
would love to clarify the global foundries question. So Peter, you're going to come back with some suggested language that would clarify exactly what you're talking about, make clear to the full council so that global foundries commitment to 2025, 2030 GWSA obligations is clear, and that is clear to the different parties who may be playing a role in this process, the legislature, the PUC, ANR and its rulemaking authority. So we'll have an opportunity to look at that language.
Yeah, so I would put that, I would put language into the table that we're talking about, responding to comments to, with essentially where we are, what the intent was. There are some pieces of that, whether there are specific 2025 or 2030 commitments in there that I can't speak to because I'm not Global Foundries in this process. And that's where it's a little bit awkward, but so it is the intent of the Agency of Natural Resources that this is a pathway to achieve the emissions reductions as required in the Global Warming Solutions Act. It is, which includes all of the various milestones along the way, 2025, 2030, 2050. Whether that's a binding commitment in 2025 and some additional work to understand how to get to the work to get to 2030 as required by the act, that's a possibility as well. Just as there are some things that we're working towards with the eye towards the immediate actions, and then continuing to look at ways like with the land use sector, where we know we have longer term efforts that we're not precisely sure how we're going to, what the goals are around those things now, but we know we have more work to do. We don't want to lose that momentum. And so I can provide where we are now. It's obviously it's a bit of a complicated, timing perspective.
It is, but that's also all the more reason it seems important to be as clear as possible in this moment to inform. I mean, it's very awkward timing.
That's why, we tried to be as straightforward as possible in the write-up to essentially say that pursue those emissions reductions as required by the GWSA through the PUC process, or if that is insufficient, achieve those emissions reductions through A&R rulemaking, right? That's the basic trade-off. Obviously, there's a lot of detail in what that means, and people have different sort of value perspectives on those different components that we can add some flavor to, but I think it's important that we do so, that respects the process that's ongoing, that is outside of this council's activity to some, so, but I will provide councilors with all the information that they need to be able to evaluate the options.
I look forward to thank you.
All right, thanks. We're now at the midpoint of our meeting today, and we've agreed that we would hear public comment on the first half of the conversation. So let me open the floor to folks who would like to address this subcommittee. I have Annette and then Matt Voss.
It looks like Matt Coda is also raising his actual hand.
Oh, okay.
Good afternoon. I'm actually going to jump ahead on your agenda. I don't know that I'll be able to be with you for the rest of the meeting, but I see legislative action and rulemaking on the agenda. And before I saw that, I was going to actually ask about it. Given that this report is coming in at the second half of the biennium, and that there is a lot that this subcommittee is likely to be putting on the table for action, I'm hoping that you will discuss when you have that portion of this meeting, what exactly you are going to be asking the legislature to do in the upcoming session, noting that some of the pieces you're talking about, like the clean heat standard and the renewable energy standard, go through committees that are pretty overburdened already. And so I'd like to get a reality check on how you envision this going forward once your recommendations go to the legislature, and in specifically what it is that you anticipate them taking up in the next section. I also just wanted to offer the observation that, especially around the weatherization and costs and workforce, that what I'm anticipating is that a lot of the discussion in this upcoming session is going to be about housing and people who don't even have houses. And so how are you going to balance the desire to weatherize a lot of homes when the urgent need exists for housing? So thank you very much for hearing my comments. Good luck.
Thanks, Annette. Your last point is very well taken. Serious issue for the legislature in particular to address. Matt Voss and then Matt Coda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your hard work today. And Commissioner Walk, thank you for detailing that clarity and the whole table idea and everything like that. And thank you, Ms. Miller, for asking for that clarity. I just wanted to double check one more time, just because those of us at Rev are very interested in this whole Global Foundries issue. Where would that table be posted? And do you have any sort of day of when that would be up?
So we haven't yet talked about when those comments will be due back from the task leads here to then share, but we will by the end of the meeting have resolved that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Matt Coda.
Yes, thank you very much. In the parlance of this committee, I really do appreciate Richard pointing out the issues with existing homes and the introduction of heat pumps, not talking about new builds, talking about existing homes. And I know numbers are different and everyone has different numbers. I'm not challenging anyone's numbers, but as I look at our heat pump installations, because as you know, we're not just selling heating oil, we're installing the heating systems. And so we install many of these heat pumps that have gone in. And looking at TJ Poor's numbers, looking at our own data, looking at some regional stuff, we figure we have about 12 to 13% of Vermont homes now have a air source cold climate electric heat pump. And given the rate which we see now this year of 11,000 heat pumps going in, we're static. We just did status quo, not emphasize it anymore. We would have half the homes in Vermont would have an air source cold climate heat pump by the end of the decade, very close to the CADMIS goals of where we need to be. The question is, and sort of the point is, the reason why we need the technology neutral approach that the Clean Heat Standard has, the reason why I bristle every time I hear the word switch is because these heat pumps are going in, but not all of them. In fact, a small minority of them are actually switching their primary source of heat in December, January, and February. That's where biofuels come in to augment, as Jared and Richard have spoke so eloquently about, to cover some of that heat load during the coldest months of the winter. So when we talk about heat switching, we talk about raw numbers of cold climate heat pumps being installed. We're not talking about changing out, removing furnaces or boilers, whether they're gas or oil fired or wood fired. We're talking about sharing the heat load with clean electricity, not replacing the current heat source. And so I don't know if we'll ever get to this, but as we talk about the sheer number of heat pumps that are going to go in, about 140,000 based on just the status quo in the next 8 years, how many of those homes will actually be electrically heated and how many they will be dual heating sources? Because as we all know, particularly in older homes, many people don't rely on just one source of heat, 2, 3, some even 4. So just want to make that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. George Gross.
Afternoon. Kind of joined the event a little bit late. It seemed like you changed the start time. Suffice to say, I would like to see us have a notification option so that you can be alerted if there's changes on the web page that has the calendar. Setting that aside, when I read the electric sector draft, it was part of the presentation last week. I reviewed it and I was struck by the absence of any hard numbers and hard commitments on the amount of solar capacity, what plan, if any, was there to anticipate the retirement of nuclear power in New England. There was no statements about whether Hydro-Quebec power would continue to be in the mix or increase, and so on. So as currently written, the draft is frankly devoid of many of the things that I would have expected to find in a planning document of this type. And I think as such, it's not ready for final publication. It needs to go back to the authors and they have to sharpen a pencil and deliver bona fide facts that speak to what type of allocation over what time frame are we doing our electricity and power mix. I mean, there are obviously other venues such as the PUC that would review that as part of an IRP or a specific power acquisition, a rate case, but they're well outside the public arena in the normal case of people in the general public. And the CAT, frankly, will be looked at a lot of people as the guidepost for what we're doing, what is our trajectory. And the current statement is not sufficient to that standard. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Jamie.
Richard, I'm going to suggest that we forgot to put a break into the agenda, and then I think everybody is ready for one, and would suggest that we have actually covered a little bit of the topics, the responsiveness summary and counselor outreach piece that we plan to discuss. And so I would suggest that we take till 11 or 12:58 and have some food in your face, go to the bathroom, do what you need to come back prepared to discuss the other two sectors.
I was getting ready to say the same thing, but let's agree on the time to come back. 12 what? You said?
I was saying 12:58 because it was 15 minutes.
Yeah, that
Splurge and go all the way to 1, 2 extra.
Oh boy, fine. 1 o'clock.
So at 1 o'clock we reconvene. Thanks, everybody.
And George, just for your information, we changed our meetings to 11 o'clock a couple of weeks ago, and that's been consistently on the calendar for since that point. So we did have some issues when we made that change at first, but they have been on the calendar on the website for the last 2 weeks. So, all right, we'll see everybody back at 1 o'clock.
Welcome back, folks. Let me just take a quick census, see who's here. Committee members, if you're back, please turn on your camera so we can see. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Peter, thanks for reminding us to take a break. And let's get going with the second half of the meeting. We already just we touched on some of the electricity issues, but I want to make sure that we cover all of the comments that councilors have made. So Liz, can I just turn to you and ask you to run us through?
Sure. In terms of detailed comments on the draft itself, we did receive a few. I'll say that none of them are. We received comments from Julie, from a number of others of you, all of which look to me to be implementable and aren't at the overarching level, kind of the concern level that we've been talking about. So I'll just turn to the list that we got the other day, unless there are others that you all want to add and discuss as well, because I think these hit on what George mentioned in his comments as well, and public comment. And specifically, among the, let's see, I tried to open this before we started, hold on. Among the comments that we got were issues of equity in the PUC, concerned about the reliance on any recommendation running through the PUC, given the question about whether they've received DEI and environmental justice training and how it would be monitored. So basically a concern about the forum for addressing further questions and concerns. That was one of the overarching questions. Another, and again, I don't know if this was more than one person or not, but we certainly have heard this in public comment, Hydro-Quebec and concerns about generally, and I assume not just with respect to that energy source, concerns about impacts outside of Vermont. And then the third that was put on the list we looked at the other day is feels to me like it's applicable outside of electricity as well, and that's increased chemical usage, as the commenter put it, with the increase in electrification. And I presume that's referring to the source materials for some of the equipment as well as the energy sources. EVs, for example, we've seen that comment. So in terms of what to do to respond, I was looking at the draft over the break to determine whether it hit, Richard, the question you raised, as well as to respond to George's public comment, and then get your feedback. The draft we created was meant to point out the questions that still need to be addressed and looked at in a design to move to 100% either carbon-free or renewable in future years. And in looking at the draft, I think it does, Richard, do what I had recalled, which is raise that as a question, and specifically pointing out other states that have in the recent years evolved their standards. One of the ways they've evolved that standard includes dealing with the existing energy versus additionality, and pointing out that additionality, new renewables, is an important goal for Vermont to consider and adopt in any revised res. And by doing that, you would also thereby limit existing renewables as a portion of the total pie. And pointing out that Massachusetts, for example, has done a version of that by adopting a specific clean energy standard with an existing component. That's in the draft as a way of pointing to a path forward where any resource, whether it's Hydro-Quebec or any other existing resource, would not be seen as sort of taking over or crowding out the ability for new renewables to come into the mix. I could go on, but I think it might be more helpful to hear from others in terms of what you all think we should do to, so I had expected that Ed and I would come back with a revised draft. I did not see a place other than perhaps the question on the PUC, whether instead of just, recommend the PUC study, the recommendation should be broadened to say, PUC or the appropriate body, because the legislature might direct that it be, for example, an outside expert or a joint appointment between ANR and DPS, for example. So I think there are some broadening we could do there. But otherwise, I'd be interested in hearing what others think in terms of blockers for going forward. And I'd also be happy after that to address the comment we got in public comment about whether this should be more detailed or not.
Okay. So it sounded like there were 2 or 3 questions for the committee to discuss with Liz. Number one, what should we say about the PUC as a forum for decision-making about the res? The same thing would come up, by the way, for the clean heat standard, where the recommendation at this point names the PUC as the preferred supervisory body, but does not specify that it has to be the PUC. What do committee members think about the opining on equity and the PUC? Seems like it's a head scratcher, or it's something you think doesn't need to be in the plan.
Could I just ask for reaction? Right now, the draft says we recommend the General Assembly direct the PUC utilizing expertise as appropriate to identify, review, and research as needed design parameters for 100% carbon-free or renewable electric portfolio standard that equitably promotes electrification. That's the key sentence that I just read. What would the subcommittee's reaction be to broadening that to just say something like either take out the specific direction of the PUC and leave it to the General Assembly, or say direct the PUC or other state agencies and experts as appropriate. In other words, make it either or. And I'll note that Ed's not here, so I'll say I'm freelancing on that.
Yeah. So I certainly want to hear what other committee members think. I actually think being a little more specific is more useful to people, and that the way it's crafted now is helpful. And it builds on the work that's already, the way we do it already, frankly. And so I guess I think it's more helpful in the plan to name the PUC. I think it's fine to do as we do with the clean heat standard and say, if the legislature chooses another path, that's okay too. But at least the starting position would be, we would like the PUC to do it. And if there's an issue with respect to the ability of the PUC to take issues of equity into consideration, then my recommendation would be to change the enabling legislation of the PUC, because that would be a desirable thing anyway, if we think that there are unwarranted limits on the PUC's ability to.
I didn't take the comment to say that. It wasn't a legal authority comment. I took the comment to be a concern about whether, you pointed out this is how it's done now. I think bluntly the concern is this is how it's done now, and whether equity demands a broader approach, particularly with concern about, and it's not just the PUC, I would imagine, but concern about whether state bodies that have been doing this as is have the training, expertise, and ability to sort of broaden and include that equity scope. So another thing we could do, just working through how to actually create a recommendation that meets concerns, would be to specifically state that if the PUC is to take this on, not only should they find a path that equitably promotes electrification as now stated, but should do so in an equitable and inclusive process.
A quick reaction, that sounds like a good addition to me. Joey and then Peter.
I agree. That sounds like a good addition, Liz. I also think that the PUC takes a lot of its marching orders from the legislature. So I think your concept of expanding and highlighting that the legislature might have a role in directing the PUC to look more broadly at and consider more concretely equity outcomes and equity benefits. And I think that would be very helpful. Maybe there's a way to frame that. I also think, the distribution, greater distributed generation is a really important resilience component. And I think that should be potentially a consideration in the PUC process to reverberate with the work happening more broadly across the Climate Council. I have a couple of other comments, but I don't know if Peter wants to weigh in on this provision. But I think, I'll just leave it there for right now.
Peter?
So I think some of this goes back to our conversations around sort of the cross-cutting issues around that, that I appreciate Joey and Gina flagging for us around sort of, do we endorse the environmental justice bill that's being considered by the legislature currently? That sort of speaks to broader policy items that, because equity is it feels a little strange to me to call it out in one place and not be explicit everywhere else, given the nature of our work. And so that's really the sort of, I understand the conversation, but it's more about what are we gonna miss if we simply add it to one item at a time. That's I guess where my concern lies.
Okay.
So I don't know, maybe Joey, if you have an update as to where that, as sort of our cross-sector mitigation rep on that, for that work, where that stands, so we know what we should be anticipating being able to rely on or not.
Tell you later after 2 today. I don't have more of an update at
All
this
right.
moment, but I can for the next conversation, but I certainly will bring that into this conversation. I agree. And at the same time, again, it may be helpful to have these sort of concepts cross-referenced so they point generally in the same direction. I don't know, Jane, if you want to speak more to that question that Peter raised.
Just that the cross-cutting group is meeting at 2 o'clock. It's one of the issues to discuss.
All right. Well, and Joey, we might take a recommendation from that group as to how often we want to make the cross references. But Peter, I think, makes a good point that we have to be careful if we make the cross references here and there, but not comprehensively, don't think it through comprehensively, then one wonders, was that intentional or it was just happenstance the way the drafting got done. So maybe that's just to be revisited after your cross-cutting meets and makes a recommendation to us. The other substantive comment that Liz made that I think bears some discussion is this business about new renewables versus total renewables, and whether there's even a further conversation about new renewables being within the state.
Sure. Yeah. And the way the draft had handled that, Richard, is pointing out that those are issues for design. Certainly the current res has the only specific carve out it has with regard to the type of renewable is local distributed. It's 10% now, and there is no additionality required beyond that. And I think we broadly heard, and I believe this subcommittee, I know certainly Ed and I agreed, and I believe the subcommittee agreed, we broadly heard that in a redesign, there should be greater additionality. And so the question is how and at what level and type, given the need to balance resource types, both in and out of state, and the co-benefits some allow for, and affordability on the other hand as well. So those ideas are attempted to be captured in the draft using existing renewables and new resources, including the right mix for equity and additionality is the lead bullet in that part. And there's some other points that are made in the draft about recommending the new requirements are designed to fit already procured resources in order to obviously not create upset for electric customers and affordability, while also building in, I mean, there's plenty of room basically if we move from 75 to 100, not only making sure that we have significant additionality, but that existing resources, while they will continue to have a role, are well defined. And so to meet the comments we've heard, not kind of taking over the pie as we move to even more renewable electricity. So figuring out whether the draft does that, I think would be really helpful. I understand the comment, and I don't think it would be, not my expectation anyway, that the council is going to resolve that with specific recommendations. I think the subcommittee has agreed that's probably not either likely or even most productive given the relative contributions of the sectors. So I'll stop there and ask if folks think we should have, and also the draft references, by the way, the work that the Science and Data Subcommittee did and recommended for future GHG inventories, because obviously any res will be designed in such a way that the definitions will tie. And so I think picking up future changes that may occur there is also something that can and will happen. And we didn't believe it was the right place to do more here, given that that had been assigned to a specific subcommittee. And also applies to all resources, although we heard it most frequently with regard to Hydro-Quebec. It's certainly not the only resource. We saw something, the Wall Street Journal just yesterday had an article about the tremendous increase in coal usage that has come about in the last year, and what that does for the solar panel industry, essentially, if you look at it on a total carbon basis. And obviously that's not good either. So we have to kind of think about this across resources as that subcommittee suggested.
Thanks, Liz. Joey?
Well, I think, Jared, did you want to go? Because you may want to directly respond to that.
Sure. I mean, I guess I would just say, stepping back and thinking about where we are in less than a month to December 1st, I don't think we have and recognizing that this first plan is step one, not the end of the road. I don't think we need to or should add more detail than is currently in the recommendations. I think that I agree with Liz that those are very complex, important conversations that need to be had at a deliberative manner in the legislature with input from, research and stakeholders and the public. And that we're not going to, would be very skeptical that we can go much farther than we already have, especially because so many of the considerations about a res redesign, I think, are primarily going to relate to questions of resiliency in terms of impacts on ratepayers, in terms of local jobs, things that are very important, but that are not going to appreciably change the overall emissions profile. I am confident in the modeling that EFG and CADMIS has provided and the modeling that EIN has done, that while these questions are very important for a whole host of social and public reasons, the difference between what the current res design is and 100% clean electricity standard versus 100% renewable energy standard are not going to, at least in the short term of 2025 and 2030 that we're looking at, make major differences in terms of how our recommendations add up to meet the emissions reduction requirements. And so that's another reason I think it's more appropriate to say that even though this detail isn't available now in this plan, we know it needs to happen, and it's going to be a process that needs to continue. But I don't think we need to resolve it or can resolve it in the next month.
Thanks, Jared. Joey?
I mean, Jared alluded to some of it, and maybe I'll just follow up with Liz, because part of it is like, are there more concrete questions that we could ask their process? Like for Hydro-Quebec, what are the implications and opportunities with setting like a cap on Hydro-Quebec to achieve some of the job creation, resilience benefits? So I guess I'd want to look more at the questions that you're asking to think about opportunities to improve it. But I fundamentally agree. I don't think we're going to get to the level of clarity in this moment between now and December 1st. So I think there's more work to do, but directionally, I think we're starting to point in the right direction. So thank you.
All right, thanks. Jared made a point which I would want to reflect on for all of our work, which is that in somehow or other in this plan, this committee needs to articulate where the tons are, really, to be frank about it. Where are the big savings going? Where do we have to look and work in order to accomplish significant emission reductions as required? And one of my concerns is that at this point, I haven't seen that overview piece, and I think it's slated to be written, where we make the point that our committee is making a dozen or so recommendations, but that the tons are associated with a relatively small subset of those recommendations, and that we need to draw the legislatures and the public's attention to the work that has to happen to come anywhere close to meeting the emission reductions required. That's kind of the problem with a plan like this, where you have dozens of recommendations, but there are a relatively small number of them that are absolutely essential. So I hope that when it's all done and dusted, that when the plan is written, that we're able to do that. Any other comments on the electricity portion? Christine?
Not only electricity portion, but just want to echo what you just said, Rich. I think it's super, super important. I mean, for example, I sped read the pathway strategies and actions coming from rural resilience and built environment, I think. A lot of detail and great ideation, but I'm not even on the council and my head was starting to spin. So finding a way right up front in an executive summary or whatever to really focus on exactly what Rich just said and what that subset of key must-dos are, I think would be super, super important.
Thanks, Christine. I'm noting that that Jane is helpfully advising us that there is an overview, and we have the opportunity now to it's posted. We can take a look at it, see whether it does the job. Okay. I suspect that the people writing it are on top of this issue, but we get a chance to review it. Jared?
Yeah, and I would review it with an eye towards the things that we have elevated as priorities are primarily based on where the tons are, right? And so we need to make sure that we are, if it's not being abundantly clear in that summary, that these are the ones that get us the farthest way there, then please make that comment.
Yeah, thank you.
I wonder, just finishing electricity, I wonder if that's something Ed and I could make clearer, since ours are all enabling, they, wouldn't have come up on their own, as it were. It's probably worth making sure that's clear right up front, so that as the reader considers the level of detail of that section, they're reminded of that.
Good point. Thanks. Jared, your hand up.
Thanks, Rich. I just want to build on what you actually just said, because I think it's really important. One of the ways that I've been thinking about this is I think we need to be able to communicate both a kind of top-down perspective and a bottom-up perspective, our assessment of how our recommendations meet our legal requirement, specifically around emissions reduction. And on the first question around kind of the top-down approach, I think that thanks to the great work in the modeling that CADMIS and EFG and SEI have done with the LEAP modeling and the central mitigation pathway that is developing, I think broadly it is a very high quality piece of work that points us in the right direction, that can be a resource and a reference point for directionally where do we have to aim in terms of policies and programs to add up. It's not to say that it's locked in stone. We may realize that some numbers of weatherizations or of EVs move up or down over time as we get more data, but that's one piece. The other way I think of it is kind of a bottom up adding up, and I think that's a little bit more complicated because it's trying to assess the impact of policies and programs, some of which we have a real basis from which to make that assessment. Others, there's just so many variables that it can be really difficult to arrive at a confident recommendation. But I just want to share with you all what I'm doing as a kind of back of the envelope exercise to start, and we'll certainly kind of more formally work on and share with folks, and it may end up making sense to explicitly share it with this committee and in the climate action plan, which is where we can, noting what policies, to what degree do we have confidence or belief that what kind of share of the requirements are they going to get us to? I think some of these we can assess fairly straightforwardly. The clean heat standard by design is intended to meet the thermal sector share of emissions reduction. So by 2030, we have a reasonable basis to be confident that the clean heat standard would result in getting us 34% of the way there. The Transportation and Climate Initiative, I think, is there are more variables at play, but I've shared this with some folks. I'd be happy to share it with the full committee. I think there's a reasonable basis to assume that if Vermont joins the Transportation and Climate Initiative program, it can likely get us about a quarter of the way towards our emissions reduction. So those together are probably somewhere in the range of 58 to 60%. I think there are other pieces that we also need to characterize and add on to that, but I see those right now from the modeling, research, and analysis I've done and that I've seen from others. Those are the two biggest planks. I think that it is possible, and I want to work with others from DEC and in this committee to characterize what we think the potential emissions reduction would be from Advanced Clean Cars 2, the new California emissions regulations, both on the light duty fleet and potentially on the heavy duty fleet. And then, it'll be interesting to see how far that gets us on top of that. And then I think we will have to say at some level, there is going to be a balance remaining that will need to be met through effective program and policy design that is made with overall targets in mind. And I think that speaks really importantly to our recommendations as a group, especially the high impact ones. I think it is important that they be understood as a package that fits together to give us confidence that we can meet the legal requirements rather than a menu of options, especially when and if the council has conversations about which ones do they have concerns about. Because if to me, it's almost like I don't know what the right analogy is, like a Jenga tower or a puzzle, but if you try to take one piece out, it doesn't just affect itself, it affects others. And so, I think that there would be a real onus and responsibility on anybody. So for instance, if somebody decided to say that they had a concern about a clean heat standard or TCI, how would you then make up the 34% or 24% reduction requirement that this committee has achieved consensus at as is necessary, and that's why it's in our recommendations. So I just wanted to share that update. I'm happy to work with others on that, but I do think we want to try to have as much confidence as we can that we have a reasonable basis to believe we'll meet our legal requirement, and I think that can be both a bottom-up and a top-down modeling exercise.
Thanks, thanks, Jared. Any further comments along those lines? I agree that we need to, articulate in sector by sector. If you're not going to do it this way, what way would you do it? Has to be the question posed. Okay, shall we move on? Transportation.
Sure, I can start. So in response to the survey, unless I'm interpreting it wrong, I think we got 3 questions / comments. One comment related to EV charging rates, one comment asking for clarity related to the Transportation and Climate Initiative and how to ensure, as we hope it will, equity, concrete equity outcomes. Love to explore that with you. And then one sort of comment, not necessarily a question, related to sort of just general concern for the whole transportation package related to equity and an assessment or an assertion that there hadn't been engagement of low-income representatives being at the table. So I think one is a process question, and I'm very interested in trying to answer that and shed more light on the process, how we arrived to date, knowing absolutely that there's far more work to do. But substantively, I think maybe we should start first with the questions or the comments and I think, again, this is one of the reasons I sort of recommended maybe a small group task force conversation, because I fundamentally think there are more questions or comments than those three. So I feel like we're at a little bit of a disadvantage, although we've had these conversations, and like the thermal sector and electricity, I mean, we've tried not to hide the ball on our high level strategies. I think, we've tried to put out there and make clear what we think, as Jared noted, is a package of strategies that ultimately are going to help us make progress towards the 2025, 2030, and ultimately the net zero goal. Again, recognizing transportation in a rural state is 40% of our emissions profile, and it's complex and it's challenging, it's interconnected, and it's going to have impacts on people's lives. So ensuring that we are engaging and understanding what those impacts are to the degree, so that we are, to the degree we are able to mitigate and proactively address them. So, I guess in terms of process, I don't know, Gina, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I was going to talk about process. And so
Well,
maybe you're going to do that now, or I just want to reflect back on what was discussed with in the beginning of this meeting about how we need to work with DEC staff to incorporate the comments in some kind of table, which we'll do, and we will adapt our forms to the extent we can. We're actually going to meet this afternoon to talk about that, similar to what the thermal folks have done. So that's good. But Joey's raised a really good point, and that is the issue of equity, I guess, is going to get booted up to a larger document, but we need to keep talking about it somewhere here. And then also this big process question that someone raised. I don't think we're going to be able to deal with that sufficiently. That needs to happen maybe somewhere else, but that's something we should talk about now. And then also, I was wildly disappointed that the council never got to transportation, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen, correct? The way things are, maybe in a future iteration. And I might have missed something in the beginning. I was at a doctor's appointment with my husband at the very beginning of this meeting, so I had to be turned off. So maybe you said something, Jane, and you can talk to me off separate from this.
I guess before Jane, you jump in, I would make the point for everybody that the council is not going to sign off on anything without having a thorough discussion on it. And so when that will occur is a little bit TBD at this point, but do not worry. This was not them saying we endorse this slate without discussion. So.
Okay. Sorry if that's redundant for everybody. So.
No, I guess I would just add one clarifying point for that, and then a follow up on the equity component of the work. Definitely that the meeting on the 16th of the council is to come back to issues that were not addressed in this meeting this week and the meeting this coming Tuesday. The steering committee, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, is meeting tomorrow, and I think we're going to talk about the need or capacity for additional meetings, additional ways to have conversations, and think about the process to get us between today and December 1st. And hopefully some more clarity will come out after that tomorrow. And then I just wanted to go back to the equity component of considerations in your specific sectors and recommendations, and just put a finer point on what is being considered by the cross-cutting group. So there is the EJ policy under consideration as a recommendation that would be lifted up to the full council as the cross-cutting pathways are lifted up, which is the same day, the 16th, in 2 weeks. I do not think that speaks specifically, though, to the implementation of equity, like broadly in how we're putting forward recommendations and policies. It's just one appreciation and understanding that there's the need for possible of a larger supporting system for equity in the work of state government and beyond. But I will say that there is an implementation section of the climate action plan, and you can see it's posted online. I can drop it in the chat after I finish speaking. A draft of that section coming from Just Transitions that speaks to how we further refine the application of the scoring rubric, how we think about public engagement, how we reach out to different components of Vermonters and sectors in order to further engage this work after December 1st. So that is also something to speak to, but again, these are sort of higher level considerations than what you may want to bring forward in your own recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, our TCIP recommendation doesn't go forward without some kind of an equity aspect to it that's specific to it. So we're going to continue to, I guess we must continue to beat that drum. I mean, one thing that was surprising to me, and this is a question for you, Peter, when you were introducing the topics, you talked about under charging rates, you started, I think you were referring to loss of revenues to the gas tax. And that is a big sort of larger issue, kind of like the bigger issues around housing, let's say. And I've been thinking about that a lot myself. We haven't really raised it. And then to hear you talk about, if that in fact is what you're talking about, there was a
comment in the response to the survey. So I was trying to address some of those at the same time. That specific context was raised up. And so I wanted to clarify that what we were discussing was the desire to have beneficial electricity rates for charging, but that it also fit in a broader context of an ongoing discussion that's been happening for several years around how to raise, essentially fund the road network as we transition to electricity. So I was trying to be adaptive on the fly with some of the comments that we viewed in advance. And if that wasn't effective, I apologize.
Maybe I know too much about that issue. It's large and it's big and it's hugely complicated. And by sort of sticking it there made me wonder if we're going to go down some rabbit hole that somebody needs to go down at some point, but I don't know if that's the council's role. So I was surprised.
The goal was to pull the council out of that rabbit hole, because that is, it's been discussed but not resolved. Certainly.
Well, at no level of government.
Well, that's not true at all. There was a giant PUC proceeding that considered it over the last couple of years.
I'm talking about how you fund transportation writ large in the gas tax, and what is the future of as vehicles become more efficient and we switch to other fuels. How do we deal with that? And there is this PUC little component to it, but there's much larger issues nationally and up at state level. I would argue that related to a whole bunch of things I want to talk about right now.
Yeah, I was going to say,
anyhow, let's not talk about that right now.
Let me just jump in. I want to jump in just to nail the point that this committee is not going to
talking about that.
Address the question, how are we going to fund a road network? Okay, I mean, we could in another year, but we're not going to do it now.
Right. Yeah, it might be something the council wants to take on because there's a real issue around efficiency and fuel switching and the gas tax.
Whatever, but we're not doing it in this plan. Just let's save ourselves that. Right. It's worse than.
Okay, so when we go to make our revisions, we'll keep that in mind.
That would be a great comment to respond to in the table that we're making, and simply say that that's sort of outside the scope of the work that we're doing here, recognizing that it's a longer term issue.
Good.
Just acknowledging it and moving on.
Thanks.
Right. Bram and then Joey.
I just want to note that the Tax Structure Commission did make a recommendation to the legislature to have a road use fee attached to registering electric vehicles to continue to support highway construction during the transition from gas to electric. So I agree with the fact that we don't need to deal with it.
Thanks. Joey.
Okay. Yeah, my question, I kind of wonder, because the comment related to the EV charging rate seems bigger. we just addressed it. I want to loop back and put a finer point on what the exact question is so that it warrants a response. I think I understand it, but I'm not 100% clear. So I kind of wonder if we want to dig into TCI, or if there are things that other questions that you all have as cross-sector that you haven't yet raised, or you think we should proactively address either through an FAQ. Peter, I'm happy to offer some thoughts related to TCI and how I think it does address equity and what we would hope to do with a complementary policy. And then sort of the process related to how we've considered our recommendations to date. But I guess I'm just asking, with 15 minutes and likely a public comment period, what's the best use of our time in this moment?
I would say we also need some quick opportunity to address the item on the agenda relative to rules and legislative next steps, and because I think that's just something to flag. We need to form a quick body to think about those things. Joe, I would say I think you have the opportunity to speak to the comments that were made in writing in the tables that you're going to create without. I think we could continue to have this conversation for hours and hours and hours, but I think show the work. I think what would be useful from my understanding is sort of, when do task leads, assuming I've already talked to the staff that will be involved in creating those tables, and they're in the process now, when do you think is reasonable to be able to respond to the comments as they've been made? Sort of what's our deadline for that?
I don't think it's going to take very long. I think we're going to talk to staff this afternoon, and right, Joey, next couple days we will have responded to the comments.
Yep. I would also say that yeah, we can take a stab at the questions and the comments to date, and unless people want us to address them here. I guess long and short of it is TCI related to equity. I just want to say it here. Embedded in the MOU that the states must sign, there is a 35% requirement that of TCI proceeds go to low-income, overburdened, underserved communities. That is a minimum and not a maximum, which is why we are recommending a complementary policy that would go beyond the 35%. Exactly what that is and how, as the question is asked, we would, like require that. I mean, that's an open question, but we're gonna, this sets a direction for the legislature to pursue, and that's what we're gonna sort of put forward. And I just would say, related to the broader process question about equity, really, it's been at the top of our minds since the beginning, and we really tried to design our recommendations based on the programs that already exist. Many of them have gone through important processes with different stakeholders, intended to try and serve lower income Vermonters, like programs like Mileage Smart, which is a really critical program. And we put it in the bucket of our recommendations because we view it as a critical program, but it is largely not a pollution reduction program. It is largely a program with other benefits that we thought are important to achieve equity outcomes. So anyway, the long and the short of it is we have tried to overlay the equity lens throughout, and I'm happy to put more pen to paper on how that process has been in this year, as well as years past that has come forward as in the package of our recommendations. So we will work with the team to put those, resolve those questions through the form, Jane, and I'll turn it over to you if you have more context or question you want to lend.
I just thought, as the meeting was coming close to an end, it would be good to talk explicitly about process and timeline. And there's a couple things on my mind. One, it does feel like your responsive survey via the table would be great to get to counselors sooner rather than later, recognizing that at the very least, the meeting on the 16th will revisit all of these issues. So trying to resolve or work out any of those prior to then would be ideal, so that we can really use that time to still dive into issues that are still remaining for counselors. And the steering committee, as I suggested, next Wednesday is going to be prioritizing how we run that meeting on the 16th. This is all, with the asterisk that maybe the whole council meeting changes after tomorrow's steering committee meeting, but that's my understanding and expectation right now. And then along those lines, you have, I just want to check in order to reach the goal of going back to the council on the 16th, just highlight again that next Thursday is a state holiday for most. And so just want to check in if you still would like to meet, if it's necessary to meet, or and find another time, how you'd like to handle that. And of course, Marion and I can both help in any way to support the compiling of the documents into one responsive survey to share from all of cross sector.
Comments, let's just deal with these scheduling issues quickly. Comments about meeting next Thursday. Is there any suggestion? I would be surprised, how do you say it, by a suggestion that we don't need to meet next week. But
I suggest that we have work to do at the task level, and that we had a great discussion on the sort of around the broader issues that folks had. And I think if we can focus on the task level, then next week is not required.
Okay, so a suggestion that the task leads determine for themselves if they want to set up a meeting that could be flexibly set next week. That your suggestion, Peter?
That would be my suggestion. I'd say let's commit to, I heard people say the next couple of days. Can we commit to a Monday close of business response to the comments so that they can be compiled and hopefully gotten to the council sort of around the time of the meeting? Whether they don't need to read it in advance because they're not necessarily going to be discussing it then, but that will give them plenty of time in advance of the meeting on the 16th to ask further questions.
Okay, so good suggestion. I think that works. Secondly, we have discussed earlier in the meeting the idea of individual task leads and counselors making one-on-one contacts with other counselors who have raised specific questions, just to help them understand our proposals. And I would recommend that we do that in the next few days regardless. Gina, and then Christine, and then Liz.
You're muted, Gina.
I am off. I had another substantive thing to raise with transportation. Maybe I've missed that boat. It's floated away. Pardon me?
Let's continue the procedural
Okay.
conversation and come back if we have time. Christine?
So I just want to repeat back what I think I just heard as the next assignment, so that by end of business on Monday, November 8th, did Peter just ask us to have our revised narrative sections by sector and the table that's now at the end of the guidance document filled out, or something different?
Just the table.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just the table for the comments that we've received.
Well, that's a good question, actually, in terms of
It's going to be mine.
for now. Well, it's probably going to need to be both. Now that I think about it, because if we're going to have the updated materials to the full council a week in advance for the meeting on the 16th. Yeah, I think it probably behooves you to work on both at the same time. It sounds like you've done that already, Christine.
There's more to do, but so you would like
Right.
the revised narrative section for each sector and the table filled out that's at the end of the new drafting guidance document.
The table will be provided to you by Brian Woods to help facilitate that process, and then we can pull those all together into one kind of responsiveness piece. But yes.
Yeah, and I would expect that frequently the answer in the table would be, this question is addressed in the revised text. So they link together. Now, no meeting next Thursday. Work at the task level. Written responses by Monday, the 8th. So there are more topics, Jane, right? There's
Yeah, in particular, I wanted to flag that we have an implementation section of the CAP. Largely, the components of it are going to point to a lot of work after December 1st, in all honesty, the way that we're starting to frame up the way we're going to speak to funding and other components. One of the sections, though, speaks specifically to rulemaking and legislative action, and all of those responsibilities or considerations are going to largely come from this subcommittee. So my hope and expectation was to start to see, to set the seed with all of you around which actions you are putting forward within your bucket of work that you see a role for the legislature in, and you see a role for rulemaking. And I want to start to coordinate pulling those together in the implementation section in order to speak to those specifically. And so I can work on providing greater clarity on that expectation and send that out to task leads in order to be sending them into me. Liz?
Jane, I think that's great if you can coordinate that. And I'm certainly happy to work with you in making sure that we've covered all the bases. Liz?
Part of the clarity there, Jane, might be, do you mean rulemaking or legislative action at any time, or are you looking for immediate versus future? Because I can imagine the answer being different depending on yours.
Yeah, I think we're thinking about immediate, but I will clarify that. Thank you.
I would flag those that are potential down the road so that we don't lose that if we need to add it later. I could see as sort of this process needs to continue on in the development stage before it may be ready for follow-on action, either, through rulemaking or the legislative process. But we wouldn't want to necessarily lose that. So I would flag those items as well.
I agree with Peter, but I would also note that if we're serious about putting forward recommendations that will keep us on the right emission reduction pathway, then we may need to provide some prioritization for legislative action that is necessary to get these programs launched. So I think that council needs to do that, and I would encourage you as a council member and the other council members on this subcommittee to do that. I feel like that might be outside of the scope of our subcommittee's work. That feels, I don't know. We could spend a lot of time on that rabbit hole when I think the prioritization that we've done has elevated those that should be acted upon immediately. I don't disagree with you. I thought it was that we were in this activity making recommendations to the council. It doesn't need to be very fine-grained, but we need to prioritize actions, not only these actions need to happen in order to meet the emission reductions, but also these essential actions require legislative action. And therefore,
I guess I'm agreeing with you. I'm saying that we need to say, TCI, if it were to move forward, requires A&R rulemaking to proceed, or requires legislative action to designate the use of the funds, whatever those might be. Those are the things that we just say to, like, these actions require new authority, new funding, or new regulatory action. I think that's where we should live and breathe.
Agreed. All right, then. I know, Gina, you wanted to touch on I realize we should be hearing from the public at this point, but
Yeah, I don't want to open that can of worms, but it is, in my view, it's sort of a big issue. I don't know when.
which can of worms are?
This
just-
is on EV deployment numbers and some information we received from VTrans. We met with VTrans separately and they made comments, and Joe Flynn has expressed concerns about us achieving those numbers. And I don't think he's alone. And I think we're in a similar situation as weatherization. And I like the way we earlier framed up how we would address weatherization. It's different, but those numbers are eye-popping, and we're going to have to be able to explain that that's what we're trying to get to. We're going to have to revise over time once we see that. I love the fact we're going to get more up-to-date data to kind of assess. So future councils, this council or whoever is going to have to deal with it. But I think, Joe's point was something I've been reckoning with a lot, and that those numbers are, especially for 2025, are so ambitious. So I'm just
thanks,
I'm just
Jeannie.
throwing that out there. And the other side issue is we met with trans. It may not be reflected in the comments that we received formally, but I think they're very important comments, and we need to make sure that those are included.
It sounds to me like that should be in your table of questions and responses.
Yeah.
Joey?
Well, many of them have been included in the final draft, but we will include as we have gotten more. So, yes. My question, this is a big one too, but did the steering committee have a conversation about financing and funding? Because another core component for what we have been focusing in on transportation is answering the critical question of, if we're going to put it forward and we need to make progress towards these, yes, very big goals and targets, the fundamental question of funding and financing. We've tried to answer that question. Did the steering committee have a conversation about the money component, and is there an update that you might give us on that conversation, if that happened, or if not? Can we have that update at some point?
The committee talked about it last week. I'm happy to share that with you offline or now, but it was talked more in a broad framework of how we're going to deal with funding for December 1st and the work that is going to have to happen after December 1st, specifically around directing ARPA dollars that we won't get to by December 1st.
All right, thanks. Let's now open the floor to public comment. Any members of the public with us who would like to address the committee? All right, I'm not seeing any at this point.
Rich, George has his hand up.
Oh, there it is. George.
Yeah, I almost didn't make a comment, but I did. One of the things that I've read in the past, and I'm actually surprised hasn't been cited more often by the work they're doing, is the IPCC special report published in 2018. I think it's called Special Report 1.5 Summary for Policymakers. In essence, in that document, they characterize the glide path towards net zero emissions that we had to achieve. Published in 2018, they were saying basically we had to reduce our emissions 4% per year on all fronts. Here we are 3 years later, approximately, and obviously we hadn't gotten much progress towards that original path. And so the glide path is even steeper. And I'm not clear that I've seen any reference to that goalpost, but frankly, that ought to be considered when looking at any of the metrics you use to measure progress to goals, irrespective of the Vermont legislature's goals. Those that are set by the best available science should actually be taking the value that they have, which is authoritative. And probably if they are more aggressive than those set by legislature, it would be wise to accommodate that to the extent you can find a way to do so. At the very least, I think it's an area that you would consider including in your decision-making to see if it actually is what you're proposing is tracking somewhat in the vicinity of what is being, at this point, it would be a 5% decrease per year or nearabouts, somewhere in that range, depending on which year you want to get to net zero. In their perspective, there was benefit to be net zero by 2040. And that made the path even steeper. Thank you.
Thanks, George. All right, I believe we're at the end of this meeting and we can stand adjourned. Thanks, everybody.